On Christmas Eve, an old woman who had lost her way rang my doorbell to ask for a little food. My husband leaned into my ear and whispered, "Give her some cash and close the door, darling. She's getting the whole house dirty." I ignored him and told the servant, "Please set an additional place at the table. She will be joining us for dinner." Throughout the meal, she said something that made my husband's face turn deathly pale, and I realized who she truly was and why she had really shown up there tonight. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here today. Before the tension builds, drop a comment below, letting me know where you are watching from, which city or country. Also, please note that some elements were added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or settings is coincidental, but the lesson behind it is highly valuable for you. I have spent my entire career learning to see what others miss. A hairline fracture in a 300-year-old canvas, the kind that runs perpendicular to the grain and announces itself only when you hold the work at precisely the right angle to a raking light source patient. And unmoving the way my father taught me to be patient when I was 9 years old, and certain I already knew everything worth knowing. The false varnish a forger layered too thickly over a stolen composition detectable by smell before the eye has confirmed it that slightly wrong sweetness underneath the legitimate resin, the chemical signature of a lie dressed in period-appropriate clothing. The single brushstroke that doesn't belong, the one that betrays under examination that the hand which made it was working from observation rather than from instinct, copying what genius looks like from the outside rather than producing it from within. These are the things I was trained to find. First by my father in the studio, he kept on the ground floor of our house in Connecticut. Then by 15 years of professional work that took me from the conservation labs in Florence to a residency in Tokyo, to finally the restoration department of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where I spent 3 years learning that the most dangerous forgeries are always the ones that have fooled the most people for the longest time. My name is Evelyn Sterling. I am 30 years old. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Architecture Group, one of the most respected design and development firms on the Eastern Seaboard, with a portfolio of projects that spans from residential towers in Manhattan to civic infrastructure along the mid-Atlantic coast. I am also a certified art restoration specialist with a particular documented talent for identifying forgeries that have already passed through the hands of every other expert in the room. It is, I have come to understand over the past 9 months, a skill that applies to far more than paintings. By the time Christmas Eve arrived in Aspen, the evening I described to you at the beginning of this, with the snow and the dinner table and the pen, I had been watching my husband with the same professional-grade attention I bring to a damaged work of art, methodical, unhurried building toward a conclusion I could not afford to reach prematurely. 9 months of watching, 9 months of waiting. But to understand how I got there, and why it took the particular form it did, you need to understand where I started. Which means going back to March. A rainy Tuesday evening, the penthouse on the 53rd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its view of a city that goes on working regardless of what happens inside any individual life. And a conversation that began with the words, "I'm worried about you," and ended with me understanding with a cold and absolute precision I have not been able to unfeel since, that my marriage was not what I had believed it to be. My parents, Robert and Catherine Sterling, died on January 9th, 2025. Their private aircraft went down in deteriorating weather over the Adirondacks on a return flight from a weekend in Vermont. The investigation ran for 6 weeks and concluded with the word unforeseeable, which is the bureaucratic term for a circumstance that was no one's fault, and therefore no one's responsibility to have prevented. I used a different word. I used catastrophic. Not because I needed someone to blame, but because catastrophic was accurate, and I have always found that the most important thing you can do in the presence of damage is to describe it correctly. Not just the loss of two people I loved beyond the reach of adequate language, but the sudden vertiginous weight of everything they had built over 40 years landing entirely and immediately on my shoulders, with no transition period, no preparation, no gradual assumption of responsibility. One morning they were alive. The next, they were not, and I was the head of something enormous. Sterling Architecture Group, a real estate asset portfolio valued at roughly $50 million, and a revocable trust established jointly for me and my younger sister Claire that my parents had spent 3 decades carefully, deliberately constructing, reviewing, annually adjusting as our circumstances changed, maintaining with the kind of sustained attention that is its own form of love. Claire is 19 years old. She has been receiving specialized treatment at a residential clinic outside Zurich, Switzerland for the past 2 years, for a condition that requires the kind of continuity of care and consistency of resource that is simply unavailable to most families. My parents had made certain she would always have access to both. The trust fund was not an inheritance in the usual sense. It was the architecture of her future, the structure that would hold her life in place while she found her way back to herself. My parents had built it to outlast them. They had not anticipated that it would need to outlast them quite so soon. I buried my parents in January. By February, I was running the company. By March, I had almost convinced myself I was surviving. Then Julian sat down across from me at the kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday evening, covered my hand with his, and looked at me with the expression I had spent 5 years reading as love. "Evelyn," he said softly. His thumb moved in slow circles across my knuckles, a gesture I had always found steadying, and which I noticed that evening with a clarity I could not explain was perfectly calibrated. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it without getting upset." Something shifted in my stomach. A wordless animal alertness moved through me and went very still before I had time to name it. "I'm listening," I said. You're not okay." His voice was tender and careful, the voice of a man who has rehearsed his lines and found exactly the right register for them. "I know you think you are. I know that's what you tell everyone. But I've been watching you these past 2 months, the way you push through every single day, the way you won't let anyone near enough to help you. And it frightens me, Evelyn. You've lost both your parents. You're running a company that would test someone twice your age and twice your experience, and you are trying to hold every single piece of it together entirely by yourself." He squeezed my hand. His grip was warm. "You don't have to do that." "I'm managing," I said. "You're barely sleeping." He leaned forward slightly, and his eyes were full of something that looked from every external angle, exactly like genuine concern. "I've been talking to some people, financial advisors, trust attorneys, and I think the most responsible thing we could do right now for you, for Claire, for the company's stability, is to let me take on some of the administrative weight. Temporarily, just until you've had adequate time to grieve properly and recover some of your steadiness." A pause precisely timed. "I could manage the trust fund, handle the quarterly filings, the distribution approvals, the correspondence with the clinic in Zurich. You wouldn't have to think about any of it." The rain moved across the floor-to-ceiling windows in slow, uneven patterns, each drop catching the city light below for a fraction of a second before it was gone. I looked at my husband's face, the face I had woken up beside for 5 years, the face I had flown home to from Florence and Tokyo, and every other city that had briefly claimed my attention, and I felt something I could not immediately name move through my chest like a cold current there, and then gone before I could close my hand around it. "That's generous," I said. My voice was careful. "Let me think about it." His smile arrived warm and immediate relief, dressed in the clothing of affection indistinguishable to anyone who was not looking for the seam. "Of course, take all the time you need." He stood, kissed the top of my head, and crossed the kitchen to pour himself a drink. And as he turned his back to me, his eyes moved just for a fraction of a second, just the duration of a single breath, to the Picasso mounted on the wall above my desk. A 1963 work on canvas, oil, and charcoal, acquired by my father at auction in 2008 for a figure that required 2 years of deliberate saving. Insured at its most recent appraisal for $4.2 million. He was not looking at the composition. He was not reading the line or considering the period or registering the specific, irreducible intelligence of the mark-making. His gaze moved across the surface the way I had watched certain buyers move through estate sales, not with admiration, not with the slow, involuntary attention that genuine beauty commands, but with the flat, efficient momentum of a man conducting a valuation and moving on to the next item. My throat tightened. My hands resting on the table curled slowly into my palms. I had spent 15 years learning to identify the single brushstroke that doesn't belong. I knew with the precision that comes from that kind of sustained training exactly what it looked like when someone was examining an asset and calculating how easily it could be converted. He was not looking at the art. He was looking at the price tag. And I understood with a clarity that moved across the back of my neck like cold water that he had not been looking at me any differently for a very long time. 3 months passed. Julian said nothing more about the trust fund. He was patient, I will give him that. Patient the way a hunter is patient when he knows the animal hasn't spotted him yet. He brought me coffee in the mornings. He asked about my work with the careful interest of someone who had been coached on what questions to ask. He held my hand at my parents' memorial service in April and cried genuine tears. I think, though, by then I had begun to understand that genuine emotion and genuine intention are two entirely different things, and the presence of one tells you nothing reliable about the other. By June, I had almost convinced myself I had misread that evening in March. Almost. He came to the office on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of June. I was on the 47th floor of One World Trade Center midway through a review of the structural drawings for a mixed-use development in Hudson Yards when my assistant knocked and told me Julian was in the lobby. "Send him up," I said, and felt the cold current again, that same wordless animal alertness from the kitchen table in March. I set it aside. I straightened my jacket. I arranged my expression into something warm and a little tired, which was the expression he expected from me. He came through the door with his jacket over one arm, and that easy, expensive smile, the smile of a man entirely comfortable in rooms that belong to other people. "Surprise visit," he said, crossing to kiss my cheek. "I had a meeting 2 blocks over. Thought I'd see how my wife was doing." "I'm glad you did," I said. "Sit down. Can I get you anything?" "I'm fine." But he didn't sit. He moved instead toward the window, toward the view, ostensibly the way visitors always did, and his eyes swept the room in a single practiced arc. I watched him the way I watch a painting I haven't yet diagnosed, quietly, from a slight distance, without revealing that I am watching at all. There is a specific difference between the way a person looks at something they love and the way a person looks at something they are evaluating. Someone who loves art slows down. Their eyes settle. They lean in, drawn by something they can't fully articulate, the color, the movement, the inexplicable sense that the work is looking back. But someone who is running evaluation does something different. Their gaze moves efficiently room to room, piece to piece, with the brisk momentum of a man checking items off an internal list. Julian moved through my office the second way. The Picasso first a longer pause there than anywhere else, his head tilting slightly, the way people tilt their heads when they are calculating depth rather than appreciating beauty. Then the display case along the east wall, where 3 rough diamonds sat in their individual mounts, uncut stones my father had acquired over 20 years, each one documented and insured, each one worth more than most people earn in a decade. Julian's eyes stopped on the display case for 4 full seconds. I counted. "These are new," he said, nodding toward the diamonds. "They've been there for 3 years," I said pleasantly. He laughed, a light, self-deprecating sound. "I never pay enough attention. I'm sorry." He turned toward me then, and his expression shifted into something softer, more deliberate. "How are you really doing, Evelyn? And don't tell me fine. Tell me the truth." My heart squeezed not with tenderness, but with the specific ache of recognizing a performance and knowing the performer believes it is working. "I have good days and hard days," I said, which was true enough to say without lying. "The company keeps me focused. Claire called last week. She's responding well to the new treatment protocol." Something moved across Julian's face at the mention of Claire. Quick, almost imperceptible. The corners of his mouth stayed in position, but his eyes shifted just a degree, just enough the way a compass needle shifts when it passes over something magnetic beneath the surface. "That's wonderful," he said. She's so strong. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He drew it out, glanced at the screen, and in the half second before he turned it face down against his thigh, I saw his jaw tighten. Not irritation, alertness. The specific physical response of someone receiving information that requires immediate processing. He pocketed the phone smoothly. Sorry, work. I should let you get back to it. He crossed to me, kissed my cheek again, and squeezed both my shoulders with his hands. Take care of yourself. That's an order. Yes, sir, I said and smiled. I listened to the elevator doors close. Then I turned back to my desk, sat down and looked at the rough diamonds in their case, the ones my father had chosen one by one over 20 years of quiet, deliberate love, and felt something harden in my chest, like resin setting around a flaw. 15 years of restoration work had taught me to recognize the precise moment when suspicion hardens into certainty, when you stop asking, could this be a forgery, and start asking, how do I prove it? I had just passed that moment. Julian hadn't come to see how I was doing. He had come to see what was still there. Beatrice Sterling had come to my wedding. She had worn a cream Chanel suit, drunk 2 glasses of champagne, complimented the floral arrangements, and left before the cake was cut. In 5 years of marriage, she had attended exactly 4 dinners at our home. She sent Christmas cards signed with her full name, Beatrice R. Sterling, in the manner of someone fulfilling a contractual obligation. When she asked about my work, her eyes moved to the middle distance in the practiced way of someone who has learned to simulate interest without experiencing it. Which is why when she began appearing at my door every afternoon in early July, I paid very close attention. The first visit came on a Tuesday. I was in the restoration studio, a spare room off the main living area that I had converted years ago into a proper workspace with north-facing light and ventilation, good enough for solvents, when the building concierge called up to say Mrs. Sterling Sr. was in the lobby. I smoothed my expression into something appropriately grateful and told him to send her up. She came through the door carrying a thermal flask and wearing a smile I had never seen on her face before, warm, unhurried, maternal. It fit her the way a costume fits an actor on opening night, technically correct, but slightly too deliberate. Evelyn, darling, she kissed both my cheeks. You look exhausted. I've been worried sick. She held up the flask. Da Hong Pao Oolong, the finest Chinese rock oolong you can find outside of Fujian province. Smoked over cherry wood. My acupuncturist swears it's the only thing that genuinely calms the nervous system. She set it on the edge of my workbench with the confidence of someone who has decided a decision has already been made. Sit. Let me pour you a cup. That's so thoughtful, I said, pulling up a stool. She poured the tea into the ceramic mug I kept on the shelf. My mother's mug brought back from a weekend in Vermont in 2014, white with a small hand-painted bluebird on the handle. The fact that Beatrice knew which mug was mine told me she had been paying attention to this room for longer than today. I wrapped both hands around the mug, lifted it toward my lips. My nose reached it first. 15 years of restoration work means 15 years of training your olfactory system to detect the nearly undetectable, the faint chemical signature of a retouching varnish applied 40 years ago. The ghost of linseed oil beneath 3 layers of overpainting, the particular sharpness of a solvent that doesn't belong in the decade the painting claims to be from. My nose had become over the years a precision instrument. What it told me now made my stomach drop. Beneath the dense smoky richness of the oolong, beneath the cherry wood and the mineral finish, and the high-altitude earthiness that made this particular tea so expensive and so distinctive, there was something else. A faint chemical whisper, a slightly metallic sharpness at the back of the throat, a tingling at the very tip of my tongue that had no business being there. My face did not change, my hands did not shake. I took the smallest possible sip, just enough to confirm what my nose had already told me, and then I set the mug down on the bench beside me and tilted it very slightly in the direction of the Japanese black pine bonsai that sat in its ceramic pot at the corner of the workbench. My father had carried that tree from a nursery outside Kyoto himself, on a trip he took the year I turned 12. He had spent 3 hours choosing it from hundreds of others, and when I asked him why that one, he said, because it has survived things you cannot see, and it grew more beautiful because of them. The nursery documented its age at over 100 years. My father insured it for $120,000. It had survived 2 apartment moves, a burst pipe, and the kind of benign neglect that kills lesser plants. "You seem a little better today," Beatrice said, watching me with those careful eyes behind her gold-framed glasses. "Are you sleeping a little more than before?" I said. "Good." She refilled my mug without being asked. "Julian worries, you know. He tries not to show it, but a husband notices these things." She paused. "We all just want to see you well again, Evelyn. Back to yourself." Back to yourself. The phrase landed with a weight she almost certainly intended. Thomas Julian's younger brother, 28 years old. The quieter version of the same blueprint arrived 4 days later when Beatrice had a prior engagement. Same flask, same tea, same careful rehearsed warmth deployed with slightly less polish than his mother's version. He sat where she had sat, said many of the same things in a different order, and left after 40 minutes. A rotation. Organized, consistent, managed. Over the next 3 weeks, I poured 9 servings of Da Hong Pao Oolong into the soil of my father's Japanese black pine bonsai. I watched the tree the way I watch a painting I am beginning to understand is in worse condition than it appears. I was not prepared for how fast it happened. Within 18 days, the bark began to split, long vertical fractures opening in the dark ridged surface like something inside the wood was trying to get out. The needles turned from deep forest green to the flat, defeated gray of ash. They came away at the lightest touch, drifting onto the white marble floor in small, silent clusters. The smell changed too, the clean, cold resin scent I had always associated with my father's study, giving way to something damp and wrong, the smell of organic matter surrendering. I crouched beside the pot one evening and pressed my fingertips gently against the base of the trunk. The wood gave slightly beneath the pressure, soft in the way that healthy wood never is. My eyes burned. My throat closed around something I refused to let become a sound. This was the portrait of what they had intended for me. Julian left his bag on the sofa on a Wednesday evening in early August. He had come home later than usual with the slightly unfocused energy of a man whose afternoon had not gone entirely according to plan. He dropped the bag on the armrest without looking at it, loosened his tie with one hand while pouring a drink with the other, and disappeared into the study with his phone already pressed to his ear. I stood in the doorway of the restoration studio and looked at the bag. It was a leather weekend tote Italian dark cognac, the kind of bag that costs more than most people's car payments. He carried it to certain meetings, the kind without agendas. I looked at it for a long time. 53 minutes to be precise, because the clock on the studio wall was directly in my line of sight, and I was by then in the habit of noting exact times. The study door stayed closed. Julian's voice rose and fell behind it in the low, careful register I had learned to associate with conversations he did not want overheard. At 9:17, I walked across the living room and unzipped the bag. My hands were steady. I want to be clear about that. They did not tremble. They did not hesitate. They moved with the same controlled precision I bring to the first examination of a damaged painting, where the cost of an anxious mistake is a tear in something irreplaceable. I went through the bag methodically. A folded copy of a term sheet, a charger, a tin of mints, a spare collar stay, and in the interior zip pocket tucked flat against the lining a glass vial. It was small, perhaps 5 centimeters long, with a brushed steel screw cap and no label of any kind. The contents were colorless and slightly viscous, catching the light the way mineral oil catches it with a faint, slow movement that suggested density. I held it up and turned it once in the light. No smell, no color, no identifying marks. My heart rate did not spike. What I felt instead was something slower and more deliberate. The sensation I associate with the moment, a hypothesis becomes a diagnosis. When the thing you feared you were looking at resolves finally and irrevocably into the thing you were actually looking at. I replaced everything in the bag exactly as I had found it. I zipped it closed. I set it back on the armrest at the same angle. Then I went to the studio, put on a pair of nitrile gloves, and collected 2 samples. The first, a small amount of the vial's contents drawn off with a clean pipette and transferred to a sealed collection tube I kept in the studio for solvent sampling. The second, a measured amount of soil from the base of the Japanese black pine, the tree my father had carried home from Kyoto, now reduced to splitting bark and gray needles that came away at a breath. One sample for what I suspected was in the tea, one sample to confirm it had already been there. I packaged both in a padded envelope, wrote a name that was not mine on the return label, and the following morning I drove to a private analytical laboratory on Raymond Boulevard in Newark, New Jersey. I had found them through a professional network I trusted. They accepted private submissions, required no personal identification beyond an intake number, charged $140 per sample in cash, and guaranteed confidentiality in writing. I paid in bills I had withdrawn from a branch ATM 3 days earlier in a neighborhood 2 miles from the apartment. I drove home with the intake number written on a scrap of paper in my coat pocket and nothing else. Then I waited. 10 days. I continued accepting the tea from Beatrice. I continued tilting the mug toward the pot when she looked away, though the tree was beyond saving, now its roots blackened and soft in the soil, the last of its needles long since fallen. I continued performing the small erosions Julian expected to see. The pause mid-sentence, the momentary confusion, the slightly too long search for a word I knew perfectly well. I was by August very good at all of it. The email came on a Tuesday morning, sent to an account I had created under the same false name, accessed only from a device Julian had never seen. The subject line was a 9-digit intake number. I opened it at the studio desk with the door closed and both locks turned. I read the report once. Then I read it again. The compound identified in both samples was BZ-quinoclidonyl benzylate, a glycolate anticholinergic agent developed for military psychological research. A substance that, administered consistently in subacute doses, produced symptoms clinically indistinguishable from trauma-related cognitive decline, memory fragmentation, disorientation, impaired executive function, emotional dysregulation. In a 30-year-old woman who had recently lost both parents and was under visible professional strain, those symptoms would look to any doctor who had been told what to look for, exactly like a breakdown. I set the tablet face down on the desk. I pressed both hands flat against the surface and looked at the wall. My eyes stung sharp and sudden, the kind of tears that come not from grief, but from the physical shock of comprehending something your body understood before your mind did. They had not tried to kill me. That would have been too fast, too traceable, too difficult to explain. What they wanted was a woman who appeared to every physician and every court in the state of New York to be losing her mind entirely on her own. Before I reveal the shocking showdown that makes my toxic husband pay the ultimate price, leave a comment with "turn the tables" below so I know you are still here with me at this very moment. Also, please note the following events include some dramatic adjustments for entertainment purposes. If you are not ready to face this ruthless truth, you can turn off the video right here. I had always understood that art was a form of control, the painter's hand dictating where light fell, where shadow gathered, where the eye was permitted to rest. What I never understood until that August was that I had become someone else's canvas. The BZ report sat in a fireproof lockbox beneath my restoration work table, sandwiched between two acid-free archival folders. Every morning I unlocked it, read the first line, "Quinoclidonyl benzylate, confirmed," then locked it again. Not because I needed reminding, because I needed to feel the cold weight of that truth in my hands before I faced Julian across the breakfast table. He was cheerful that month, unsettlingly so. "You look tired, Evie," he said one Tuesday morning, sliding a cup of coffee toward me with a smile that belonged on a catalog model. "Have you been sleeping?" "Perfectly," I said, lifting the cup and setting it back down without drinking. "You, like a man with a clear conscience." He laughed, a bright, easy laugh that used to make me feel warm. Now it made my stomach turn to ice. I smiled back. My face was a wax mask, smooth and unreadable, and I wore it the way I wore my most expensive blazer, with intention. That September I made a decision. I would not run, I would not confront, I would perform. I returned to my restoration studio on the 31st floor of the Sterling building and announced to my small team, Marcus, Diane, and our intern Priya, that I was struggling with a piece, a mid-century oil painting, a gift from a private collector. I let my hands shake just slightly over the solvent tray. I let my voice catch when I described the brushwork. "Mrs. Sterling, are you all right?" Priya asked. Her young face creased with concern. "Just tired," I said, and pressed two fingers against my temple in a gesture Julian had described once, the way you look when you're overwhelmed, Evie. It worries people. He had been coaching me, I realized, teaching me what vulnerability looked like on my face so he could deploy it against me later. So I used it first. I tipped a small amount of mineral spirits, not enough to damage, just enough to blur across the lower quarter of the painting. When Marcus gasped, I covered my mouth with both hands, let my eyes fill with genuine-looking tears. "Oh, God," I whispered. "I don't know what's wrong with me." Word travels in art circles faster than it does in boardrooms. By the following Friday, Julian had heard from 3 separate colleagues that Evelyn Sterling appeared to be unraveling. He came home that evening with a bottle of Chateau Petrus and 2 crystal glasses. "I've been thinking," he said, pouring with careful, practiced hands, "that maybe you should step back for a while, from the restorations, from the board. Just breathe." I accepted the glass. I did not drink from it. "You might be right," I said softly, and watched something flicker behind his eyes, relief, hunger, a door swinging open. He reached across this table and covered my hand with his. His grip was warm, proprietary. "I just want you to be well," he said. "That's all I've ever wanted." My fingers did not tremble beneath his. My jaw did not tighten. But beneath my sternum, something hot and furious was pressing against my ribs like a fist, because I had sat across from that face for 6 years and believed every word of it. "I know," I said. "I know you do." 3 days later, I called Daniel Cross for the first time. I had found his name through Eleanor, a name whispered in a letter tucked inside an archival envelope I had received months earlier before I understood what I was looking at. "If you ever need someone who knows where bodies are buried, financial ones call this number." He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Cross," I said, "my name is Evelyn Sterling. I believe my husband has been systematically dismantling my life, and I need someone who can prove it." A pause. Then, "How long has this been going on?" "At least 8 months that I can document," I said. "Possibly longer." "And you're still living with him?" "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. When Daniel Cross spoke again, his voice was measured, careful. The voice of a man who had learned the hard way that emotion was a liability in his line of work. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, "you're either the bravest woman I've spoken to in a decade or the most desperate." My throat tightened. My eyes went hot and prickly the way they do before tears that have nowhere to go. "Maybe both," I said. "Fair enough," he said. "Don't change anything, don't tip him off, and don't drink anything you didn't pour yourself." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself against the edge of my work table, my free hand pressed flat against the cool steel surface. "Understood," I said. When I hung up, I stood there for a long moment, staring at the lockbox beneath my table. Then I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and walked back toward the apartment, back toward the wax mask, back toward the performance, back toward the man who believed he was watching me dissolve. He had no idea I was just getting started. There are men who wear corruption the way others wear a well-tailored suit, so naturally, so effortlessly, that you mistake it for elegance. Mitchell Hale was one of those men. I first met him at a dinner party Julian hosted in September, 3 weeks after my staged breakdown in the restoration studio. He arrived precisely on time, a fact I noted because punctuality in Manhattan social circles is either a power move or a nervous habit, and Mitchell Hale did not strike me as a man with nervous habits. He was 54, broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back from a face that had the particular kind of handsomeness that comes from decades of confident living. His handshake was firm without being aggressive. His smile arrived exactly when it was supposed to. "Evelyn," Julian said, touching the small of my back with proprietary ease. This is Mitchell Hale. He handles our estate planning. A pleasure, Mitchell said, taking my hand. His eyes moved across my face with the speed and efficiency of a man accustomed to quick assessments. Julian speaks of you constantly. Does he? I smiled, warm and slightly vague, the smile of a woman who is beginning to slip. I hope only good things. Mitchell laughed. It was a rich, reassuring sound calibrated for courtrooms and conference rooms alike. Nothing but. I spent the rest of that dinner watching him. He moved through Julian's carefully curated circle of guests: a hedge fund manager from Greenwich, a city councilwoman, two art dealers I recognized from Christie's, with the fluid ease of a man who belonged everywhere and owed nothing to anyone. But 3 times during the evening, I caught him glancing at me with an expression that lasted exactly half a second too long. Not admiration, assessment. He was checking the merchandise. That night after Julian fell asleep, I sat at my restoration work table and wrote down everything I remembered about Mitchell Hale. The way he had maneuvered the conversation away from legal specifics whenever anyone asked about his practice. The way he had casually mentioned a client in Greenwich who had recently transferred management of a family trust, smooth transition, no complications, and Julian had lifted his wine glass a fraction of an inch, just enough to constitute a toast. I photographed my notes and sent them to Daniel Cross at 1:47 a.m. His reply came 4 minutes later, already on my list. In October, Julian asked me to attend a meeting at Mitchell's office on the 22nd floor of a building on Lexington Avenue. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Midtown that was genuinely spectacular, the kind of view designed to make you feel small and grateful at the same time. "We're just reviewing some estate documents," Julian said, resting his hand on my knee beneath the table. "Standard housekeeping." Mitchell slid a folder across the polished mahogany surface. Inside was a durable power of attorney, my name at the top. Julian's as designated agent, effective upon a physician's determination of incapacity. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I was certain both men could hear it. "It's just a precaution," Julian said, his voice smooth as poured cream. "Given how overwhelmed you've been lately, if something happened to you, I'd be able to make decisions without the courts getting involved. It's actually the kindest thing we can do." I looked down at the document. My hands were absolutely steady. I had practiced this, rehearsed it the way an actress rehearses a pivotal scene, but behind my eyes something was screaming. Kindness. He was calling it kindness. "I'll need time to review it," I said, keeping my voice soft and slightly unfocused. The voice of a woman who was trusting but just cautious enough to seem cooperative rather than suspicious. Mitchell nodded smoothly. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He capped his fountain pen with a small, precise click. "We want you to feel comfortable with everything." I looked up at him then directly for just a moment, and something passed between us. Not warmth, recognition. He knew exactly what this document was for. And somewhere behind his polished, professional exterior, behind those calibrated smiles and courtroom-ready reflexes, he knew that I knew it too. He looked away first. That evening, I sat on the floor of my restoration studio, back against the cold steel of my work table, knees drawn up to my chest, and for the first time in months, I let myself cry. Not the performance tears, the real ones. They came without warning, hot and ugly, shaking out of me in waves I couldn't control. My shoulders heaved, my throat burned. I pressed both hands over my mouth to muffle the sound, and I cried for the woman who had once believed that being loved by Julian Sterling was the luckiest thing that had ever happened to her. Then I wiped my face with the back of my hand, picked up my phone, and called Daniel Cross. "Mitchell Hale presented the DPOA today," I said, my voice still rough at the edges. "October 9th, Lexington Avenue office." "Got it," Daniel said. "You okay?" I looked around my studio at the unfinished canvases, the rows of pigment jars, the lockbox beneath my table. "No," I said honestly, "but I will be." There is a particular kind of grief that has no name, the grief of discovering that the life you believed you were living was in fact a stage set, that the walls were painted canvas, that the warmth you felt was a heat lamp pointed at you from just off frame. I felt that grief for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in October, sitting across from Daniel Cross in a windowless conference room on West 45th Street, watching him lay financial documents across the table one by one, like a man dealing a hand of cards that would end the game entirely. "I need you to prepare yourself," Daniel said before he began. He was lean, precise, with the kind of stillness that belongs to men who have spent years in rooms where the wrong word costs lives. His eyes were steady and gray, and they carried something I recognized, not pity, but the careful restraint of someone who understood that pity would insult me. "I'm prepared," I said. I was not prepared. The first document was a casino ledger, not American, but Macau. The Venetian Macau, to be specific. Between January 2023 and August 2025, Julian Sterling had accumulated $15 million in gambling losses, dispersed across 17 separate visits. The entries were meticulous, which told me Julian had not tried to hide them from the casino, only from me. He liquidated a portion of his investment portfolio to cover the early losses, Daniel said, pressing one finger against a column of figures. When that ran out, he started borrowing. From whom? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Initially, private lenders in Hong Kong. Then, when those loans came due, he needed something more substantial. Daniel slid a second document forward. "He forged your signature on a commercial mortgage, the Sterling building, the one on 38th Street that your grandfather built." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of the table. "The building my grandfather—" I stopped, started again. "He mortgaged it. $8.5 million, Daniel said. "The loan was issued 14 months ago through a shell company in Delaware. The lender is a private equity group with documented ties to the same Hong Kong network. The signature on the mortgage deed is yours. It is not your handwriting." My eyes burned. I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose slowly, the way I had taught myself to do in front of Julian when the rage became too large to contain. But this was not rage. This was something older and more devastating, the sensation of the ground disappearing beneath your feet inch by inch, until you realize you have been standing over nothing for a very long time. "There's more," Daniel said. Of course there was more. The third document was a trust fund statement. Claire's trust, established by our father when Claire was born, intended to cover her treatment costs at the Zurich clinic for as long as she needed them. I had never touched it. It had not occurred to me that anyone would. Julian had siphoned $2.5 million from Claire's trust over an 18-month period, routed through a series of wire transfers to an account in the Cayman Islands registered to a company called Ardent Capital LLC. Ardent Capital LLC did not exist in any business registry. It was a ghost, a name, and a number, and a void. The tears came before I could stop them. Not the quiet, dignified kind. The kind that arrived like a rupture, sudden, violent, impossible to manage. I pressed both hands flat on the table and dropped my head forward, and I sobbed in a way I had not sobbed since the night my father died. My shoulders shook, my chest heaved. Each breath came in ragged, uneven bursts that I could not smooth out no matter how hard I tried. "Mrs. Sterling," Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "Evelyn." I looked up. My face was wet, my vision blurred, and I did not care. "He stole from Claire," I said. My voice cracked on her name. "She is 19 years old, and she is in a clinic in Zurich because her mind broke down, and he stole from her." Daniel did not flinch. "Yes," he said. "He did. How much is left in her account?" A pause. "Enough to cover approximately 4 more months of treatment." 4 months. I felt the number land in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through every organ, every nerve, every carefully maintained wall I had constructed around myself since August. I wiped my face with both hands. My fingers were trembling, not slightly, not performatively, but genuinely, uncontrollably, shaking the way hands shake when the body has absorbed more than it knows how to process. "Then we move faster," I said. Daniel studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating his assessment of someone. "Yes," he said, "we do." He gathered the documents, aligned their edges with quiet precision, and slid them back into a manila envelope. Then he looked at me across the table with those steady gray eyes and said the only thing left to say, "You're not alone in this anymore." I believed him. For the first time in 8 months, I believed someone completely. She arrived on a Tuesday evening in late October when the rain was coming down in cold diagonal sheets that turned the streets of Manhattan into dark mirrors. I had just returned from Daniel's office, my eyes still faintly swollen, my jaw still carrying the particular tightness that follows a crying session you did not expect to survive when the lobby intercom buzzed. "There's a woman asking for you," the doorman said, his voice careful in the way it gets when something is slightly unusual. "She says her name is Eleanor Voss. She doesn't have an appointment." My hand tightened on the receiver. Eleanor Voss. The name from the letter. The name Daniel had mentioned briefly once. She's the one who flagged the offshore accounts first, before I even started looking. "Send her up," I said. She was smaller than I expected. That was the first thing I noticed. Eleanor Voss, 72 years old, former director of audit compliance at Banque Privée Voss et Associés in Geneva, stood barely 5'3" in her sensible flat shoes. Her white hair was pinned back with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that suggested she had not thought about her appearance in 30 years and considered this a sign of good priorities. Her coat was olive green, slightly worn at the elbows. Her eyes were another matter entirely. Her eyes were sharp and pewter gray and absolutely ferocious. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, stepping inside without waiting to be invited further, surveying the penthouse with the brisk efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. "I apologize for the unannounced visit. I find that announced visits give people too much time to prepare what they're going to say rather than say what they mean." Despite everything, despite the exhaustion, the grief, the constant low-grade terror that had become my baseline, I almost smiled. "Can I get you something?" I asked. "Tea." I stopped. Eleanor caught it immediately. One corner of her mouth lifted. "Coffee is fine," she said. "Black." We sat at the kitchen island, and she placed a small object on the counter between us. A memory card, no larger than a thumbnail, sealed inside a clear evidence bag. "What's on it?" I asked. 14 months of Julian Sterling's offshore account movements," she said, wrapping both hands around her coffee mug. Her knuckles were slightly swollen old joints but steady. 3 shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, 2 in Luxembourg, 1 in Liechtenstein. Wire transfers totaling approximately $31 million originating from various sources, some legitimate, some considerably less so. I stared at the memory card, at its innocuous size, at the devastating weight of what it contained. "How did you get this?" I asked. Eleanor took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "I spent 31 years tracking financial irregularities for one of the most discreet private banks in Switzerland," she said. "When I retired, I did not stop paying attention. Julian Sterling's name appeared in a flagged transaction report I received from a former colleague in Geneva in early 2024. The amounts were not extraordinary by themselves, it was the pattern that was extraordinary." She set her mug down with quiet precision. "I began building a file." "For how long?" 18 months. My throat tightened. 18 months. While I had been restoring paintings and hosting dinner parties and telling myself that the coldness I felt in my marriage was simply the natural cooling of a long relationship, this woman whom I had never met had been quietly, methodically assembling the evidence of my destruction. "Why?" I asked. My voice cracked slightly on the word. "You don't know me." Eleanor looked at me steadily. "I knew your mother," she said. "Catherine Sterling. We were at the University of Geneva together 48 years ago. She was the most brilliant woman in any room she entered." A pause. Something moved across Eleanor's face, not sentiment exactly, but the carefully controlled residue of it. "When I saw your name connected to Julian's in that report, I made a decision." My eyes went hot. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment, breathing carefully. "She never told me," I said. "No," Eleanor said gently. "She wouldn't have. Catherine protected the people she loved by keeping her worlds very separate." She slid the memory card 1 inch closer to me across the counter. But I am not Catherine, and I think you've been protected from the truth for long enough. I picked up the evidence bag. I held it between my fingers. Something about its lightness was unbearable the way catastrophe so rarely has physical weight. There's something else on the card, Eleanor said. A spyware application that Julian installed on your devices approximately 11 months ago. It has been transmitting data, your communications, your calendar, your location to a server registered to a company in Cyprus. My stomach dropped completely. Every conversation with Daniel, every photograph of the documents, every 1:47 a.m. message. Does Daniel know about the spyware? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He does now, Eleanor said. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a second item, a slim prepaid phone still in its packaging. Use only this from this point forward. Tell no one you have it. I took the phone with fingers that had gone completely cold. Eleanor, I said, why are you doing this in person? You could have sent this through Daniel. She picked up her coffee mug again, and for just a moment, something warm moved through those ferocious gray eyes. Because, she said quietly, someone should look you in the face and tell you that you are not losing your mind, that everything you have suspected is real, and that you are going to be all right. My vision blurred completely. The tears came freely this time, not from grief, not from rage, but from the overwhelming, almost unbearable relief of being believed. Thank you, I managed. Eleanor Voss nodded once, set down her mug, and stood up to leave, as brisk and efficient as she had arrived, as though she had not just handed me back the entire foundation of my reality. At the door she paused. One more thing, she said without turning around. Julian has no idea who I am. Keep it that way. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. I sat at the kitchen island for a long time. After that, the prepaid phone in one hand and the memory card in the other, and I cried until there was nothing left, and then slowly I began to feel something I had not felt in nearly a year. Ready. I had designed the penthouse smart home system myself 3 years earlier during a weekend in March when Julian was in Tokyo for a development conference, and I had the apartment entirely to myself for 62 hours. I remember that weekend with unusual clarity, the particular quality of solitude that settles over a space when the person who usually occupies it is genuinely absent rather than simply elsewhere in the building. I had spread the floor plan across my restoration work table, weighted its corners with pigment jars, and worked through the entire system architecture from sensor placement to camera angle to climate zone sequencing, color coding, each layer in archival ink on a transparent overlay, the way I color coded the underdrawings of old masters before I touched them with a brush. Julian had come home to find the plans still pinned above the work table, and had looked at them for a long moment before saying with the kind of amusement that contains a judgment inside it, excessive. I had called it thorough. It turned out thorough was exactly the right word. Eleanor's instructions had arrived written by hand on a single sheet of notepaper, her small, angular script pressed firmly into the page in a way that suggested a woman unaccustomed to writing lightly. Do not access anything from your existing devices. Use only the prepaid phone, and when you are ready, call this number. The 10 digits below it I had memorized before I burned the paper over the kitchen sink at 2 in the morning, watching the edges curl and blacken and release a thin thread of smoke that the ventilation carried away before Julian could have noticed it if he had been awake, which he was not. I called the number on a Wednesday morning in early November while Julian was at a breakfast meeting in Midtown. The voice that answered was a woman's young, clipped with a European accent I could not place beyond the continent. She introduced herself only as Petra, and she moved directly into the task without any of the conversational softening that people typically deploy when asking someone to do something technically complex. Mrs. Sterling, she said, I'm going to walk you through accessing your home network from an isolated channel. This will allow us to examine the system logs without triggering the spyware's alert protocols. Do exactly what I say in the order I say it. Understood, I said. What followed was 40 minutes of the most focused work I had done since the Aspen planning began, and I had been doing extremely focused work for months. Petra directed me through the building's maintenance interface via a legacy access port I had spec'd myself during the original system installation, tucked behind the utility panel in the service corridor off the kitchen, a panel I had designed, and subsequently ceased to think about entirely. My hands were steady on the terminal keyboard. My breathing was controlled. The only outward sign of what I was feeling was the faint, persistent ache in my jaw from holding it clenched, a habit I had developed sometime in August, and had not been able to entirely stop since. What the system logs revealed was, in Petra's precise word, comprehensive. Julian's spyware, a commercial-grade application called Shadowreach, the kind typically deployed by corporate intelligence firms conducting internal investigations or, in murkier contexts, tracking individuals whose cooperation they could not otherwise ensure, had been installed on my primary phone, my laptop, and the penthouse's shared tablet 11 months ago. It had been transmitting in 4-hour intervals to a server in Limassol, Cyprus, registered to an entity called Helix Data Solutions. Helix Data Solutions was, according to Eleanor's file, a subsidiary of one of Julian's Luxembourg shell companies, a detail I registered with the particular cold clarity of something that confirms a thing you already knew but had not yet been able to prove. He had been reading my messages, monitoring my location in real time, accessing my calendar, my contacts, my search history, for 11 months, which meant from the beginning. From before the August samples, before Daniel Cross, before Eleanor's letter. Before I had understood what I was looking at, he had already been watching me look. "There's something else," Petra said, and her voice shifted by a degree not alarm exactly, but the heightened attention of a person who has found something unexpected in data they expected to know the shape of entirely. "The system logs show a secondary access point. Someone queried your home security camera archive 6 weeks ago, specifically the footage from your restoration studio." My stomach turned over completely. "Which dates?" I asked. "August 14th through the 19th. The days I had gone through Julian's tote bag. The days I had drawn the pipette sample from the vial and packaged both specimens in the padded envelope, written the false return name, sealed it with the kind of deliberate care I brought to the first handling of a fragile and irreplaceable canvas. I sat down on the floor of the service corridor, my back against the cold wall, my legs unwilling to hold my weight with any reliability. The linoleum was gray and slightly gritty beneath my palms. I noted this with the peripheral attention my mind gave to physical details when the center of it was occupied with something too large to look at directly. "He knows," I said. My voice came out stripped and flat, the way voices do when the body has removed everything from them except the bare transmission of fact. "He may know," Petra said carefully. "The query confirms the footage was accessed. It does not confirm what conclusions were drawn from it. If he saw me collect those samples, then he knows you know about the vial," Petra said. "Yes." I pressed the prepaid phone hard against my ear and made myself breathe slowly. 4 counts. In 4 counts. Out the way I had learned to breathe during the months of performance when rage or grief became too large to carry without visible signs. The implications were arriving one by one in the way that the worst information always arrives, not as a single blow, but as a sequence of them, each one landing before you have fully registered the last. If Julian had accessed the footage, he had seen me collect the samples. If he had seen me collect the samples, he knew I was aware of the compound. If he knew I was aware of it, the timeline of everything he had planned had accelerated: the DPOA in October, the Mitchell-Hale meetings, the Aspen invitations arriving with increasing frequency and urgency. He was not waiting for me to deteriorate on a natural schedule anymore. He was moving because he understood finally that the window was closing. "Can you pull the crypto wallet data?" I asked. It was the next item on the list Daniel had given me. The cold hardware wallet Eleanor had flagged, the one she suspected, held approximately $3.5 million in cryptocurrency, physically hidden somewhere inside the penthouse. Julian had never mentioned it. He had never mentioned Helix Data Solutions, or the Luxembourg shell accounts, or the camera archive queries either. Julian was a man who believed deeply in the strategic value of what he did not say. Already running a signal sweep, Petra said. I heard keystrokes behind her voice, rapid, precise, unhurried. A pause. Then, there's an anomalous electromagnetic signature in your primary living area. Frequency is consistent with a hardware wallet in low-power mode. A beat. The signal is coming from your aquarium. I stood up from the corridor floor and looked through the service door into the living room where Julian's showpiece, the custom 6-foot saltwater aquarium he had researched for 4 months before purchasing, filled with live coral and slow-moving fish he had named, with the quiet enthusiasm of a man who found it easier to be tender toward things that could not talk back, sat against the north wall in its calm, luminous blue. He had insisted on installing it himself, had spent an entire weekend adjusting the filtration system and the water chemistry emerging from the process with damp forearms, and a satisfaction I had read as genuine. Had told me with considerable authority that the water pump motor generated electromagnetic interference strong enough to damage sensitive electronics, and that I should keep my laptop well away from the living room corner where it sat. The water pump motor generated interference that masked a hardware cryptocurrency wallet. I started laughing. It came out slightly unhinged, short and sharp and incredulous, the laugh of a woman standing in a service corridor at 10:30 in the morning, watching the final piece of a very long and terrible puzzle drop into its place, with the quiet inevitability of something that was always going to end this way. Mrs. Sterling. Petra's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone deciding whether to be concerned. I'm fine, I said, pressing my free hand over my mouth until the sound subsided into something more controlled. Don't touch the wallet. Don't alert the system. Leave everything exactly where it is. Understood. What do you want to do next? I straightened my jacket. I looked through the doorway at the aquarium, at its serene glow. Its oblivious fish. Its $3.5 million humming quietly in the dark beneath the water, masked by a motor Julian had told me to stay away from. I thought about the floor plan still pinned above my work table, color-coded in archival ink, the camera angles I had mapped myself, the access port I had spec'd and forgotten, thorough. I want to invite my husband to Aspen, I said, for Christmas. I had always known about Sandra. Not in the way that wives in films know the lipstick on the collar, the unexplained late nights, the perfume that isn't yours clinging to a jacket lapel. I had known, in the quieter, more corrosive way that comes from 6 years of small observations accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a glass. The way Julian's voice changed register when he spoke her name on phone calls he thought I couldn't hear. The way she had looked at me exactly once at a Sterling Group function in 2023, not with guilt, but with the particular cold appraisal of a woman who has already decided the outcome of a competition you don't yet know you're in. Sandra Reeves, 34 years old, Julian's executive assistant for the past 3 years. A woman with a master's degree in organizational psychology from Columbia. A talent for anticipating what people needed before they asked for it. And as Daniel Cross had discovered in November, a separate phone registered to a burner account that she used exclusively to communicate with a man named Pavel Orlov. Pavel Orlov was not an accountant. He was not a lawyer. He was a logistics consultant, which is the term used by people in certain circles for a man who makes problems disappear. Daniel called me on the prepaid phone on a gray Tuesday morning, his voice carrying the careful, measured urgency of someone delivering information that requires the listener to remain calm. Sandra commissioned Pavel 3 weeks ago, he said. The initial target was you. I was standing at the window of my studio, holding a brush I had not used, looking out at the Hudson. The words landed with a strange, muffled quality, the way sounds do underwater. A staged accident, Daniel continued. The plan was a gas leak at the penthouse, timed for an evening when Julian had a documented alibi, a client dinner in Greenwich on December 12th. December 12th was 11 days away. My hand tightened around the brush handle until my knuckles ached. You said the initial target was me, I said slowly. What changed? A pause, the kind that means the next sentence is going to be complicated. Sandra found out about the Macau debts, Daniel said. All of them, not the $15 million Julian had managed to partially conceal the full amount. Julian's total exposure, including the Hong Kong private lenders, is closer to $23 million. Sandra had apparently been operating under the assumption that Julian would be solvent once he acquired your assets and the Sterling building mortgage was restructured. Another pause. She reassessed. She reassessed, I repeated. The new target is Julian. I sat down on my studio stool and pressed the phone hard against my ear, trying to organize what I was feeling into something manageable. It was not entirely possible. There was relief, cold, shameful, immediate relief, that I was no longer the one in Pavel Orlov's calendar. There was fury at the casualness of it, the transactional efficiency with which Sandra had simply redirected the order the way you redirect a package to a new address. And beneath both of those, something more complicated, something that took me a moment to identify as grief. Not for Julian, never again for Julian, for the version of myself that had once believed with her whole heart that she was loved. Evelyn, Daniel's voice pulled me back. I need you to focus. I'm focused, I said. My voice was rough but steady. Sandra doesn't know we're watching her. Pavel doesn't know we're watching him. Julian doesn't know any of it. That gives us a window, but it's closing. He paused. Sandra will move before Christmas. She wants it done while Julian is isolated, preferably outside the city where response times are longer. Outside the city, isolated, Christmas. Aspen, I said quietly. That would be her ideal scenario, yes, Daniel said. Which means the Aspen invitation you've already extended to Julian is now a variable in two separate plans, ours and Sandra's. I stood up from the stool and walked to the window again, staring out at the pewter gray river below. A barge was moving slowly upstream against the current, heavy and deliberate, and I watched it for a moment before I spoke. Then we let Sandra believe she still has the advantage, I said. We don't alert Julian. We don't move against Pavel yet. We let everyone arrive in Aspen exactly as planned. That means Julian will be in genuine danger for a period of time, Daniel said carefully. You understand that? I understand that, I said. But Julian Sterling needs to stand in a courtroom, Daniel. He needs to answer for Claire's trust fund, for the forged mortgage, for the BZ, for all of it, in front of a judge on the record in public. If Sandra's plan succeeds, none of that happens. My jaw tightened. I am not letting him escape into a gas accident. He doesn't get that. There was a silence on the line longer than Daniel's usual pauses. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something that was almost but not quite admiration. I'll coordinate with the FBI field office, he said. Agent Patricia Novak, she's been building a parallel financial fraud case against Mitchell Hale for 8 months. This gives her Julian and Sandra on the same night. Good, I said. Evelyn? His voice dropped slightly. Be careful in Aspen. Sandra is not sentimental and she is not patient. I looked at my reflection in the studio window, a woman with paint-stained fingers and swollen eyes, and a prepaid phone pressed to her ear, standing in the ruins of a life she had spent 6 years building. Neither am I said. I hung up, set the phone down on the work table, and picked up my brush. My hands had stopped trembling entirely. I mixed cadmium red into titanium white until I had the exact shade I needed, the color of dawn, over a mountain cold and irreversible, and coming whether you were ready or not. Then I began to paint. 48 hours before Christmas Eve, Daniel Cross called me at 6:14 in the morning. I was already awake. I had not slept properly in 11 days, not since the conversation about Sandra and Pavel Orlov. Not since the weight of what we were orchestrating had settled fully into my body and made a home there. I had been lying in the dark beside Julian, listening to him breathe with the easy, untroubled rhythm of a man who believed himself completely in control, and I had been running the timeline in my head the way I used to run brushstroke sequences before beginning a restoration forward, backward, forward again, checking for errors. Pavel moved last night. Daniel said the moment I picked up. He drove a utility van to a gas supply depot in Hoboken, purchased 2 commercial propane canisters under a contractor's license that does not belong to him. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and walked quietly to the bathroom, closing the door behind me before I spoke. He's planning to move on Julian in Aspen, I said. Within the 48-hour window, yes. Sandra booked Pavel into a motel in Glenwood Springs, 40 minutes from the villa. He arrived yesterday afternoon. A pause. We have eyes on him. I pressed my free hand flat against the cold marble of the bathroom counter and stared at my reflection. I thought, remarkably composed for a woman standing at the edge of something that could go catastrophically wrong in a dozen different directions. What does Patricia Novak need from me? I asked. She needs you in that villa, Daniel said. On schedule, behaving exactly as planned, no deviations, nothing that might alert Julian or Sandra that the evening is anything other than what they expect it to be. His voice was careful and deliberate, each word placed with precision. The FBI team will be positioned in Aspen by tomorrow evening. 4 agents, 2 vehicles. They will not move until the signal. The porch light, I said. The porch light, he confirmed. You switch it on, they move. You have approximately 3 minutes between activation and entry. 3 minutes. I had rehearsed what needed to happen in those 3 minutes until I could run it in my sleep, which was fortunate because sleep was largely theoretical at this point. We flew to Aspen on the morning of December 23rd, Julian, Sandra, Mitchell, Hale, and I, on a chartered Gulfstream that Julian had booked with money I was fairly certain came from Claire's depleted trust fund. He was in excellent spirits the entire flight, ordering champagne before noon, telling a story about a golf weekend in Scottsdale that made Mitchell laugh too loudly and Sandra smile with her mouth but not her eyes. I watched Sandra across the aisle. She was composed and immaculate, dark blazer hair pulled back, a slim leather portfolio on her lap that I knew contained the documents Mitchell intended to present at dinner. She caught me looking once and held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before returning to her phone. She was not nervous. That was the most frightening thing about her. I turned to the window and watched the Rockies materialize below us through a thin layer of cloud white and enormous and indifferent. And I thought about Pavel Orlov in his Glenwood Springs motel room, and Daniel Cross in a rental car on Highway 82, and Agent Patricia Novak in a command vehicle somewhere in the pine trees above the villa, so many people moving in careful formation, all of it balanced on a single hinge, me. The villa was exactly as I remembered it from the previous Christmas when Julian and I had spent 4 days there in the particular silence of a marriage that has run out of things to say. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, the kind of deliberate architectural beauty that impresses everyone and comforts no one. Julian walked through the front door ahead of me, spreading his arms wide with proprietary satisfaction. Perfect, he said, turning to take in the space. Absolutely perfect. It really is, Mitchell agreed, setting his briefcase on the dining table with a small, purposeful click. Sandra moved to the kitchen without being asked, opening cupboards, familiarizing herself with the layout, and I watched her do it and understood with a cold clarity that settled over me like a second skin that she was assessing the gas connections. I carried my own bag to the master bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 60 seconds. I allowed myself that. 60 seconds to feel the full weight of what the next 24 hours required of me, the performance, the precision, the absolute unwavering control. Then I stood up, smoothed my jacket, walked to the window and looked out at the mountain. The sky above it was deepening toward violet, the first stars appearing at the edges, cold and sharp and very far away. My phone buzzed once. A message from Daniel, 4 words on the prepaid screen. Everyone is in position. I put the phone in my pocket, squared my shoulders, and went to help Sandra set the table. Christmas Eve arrived the way all consequential days do, quietly, without ceremony, wearing the ordinary clothes of any other morning. I woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of wind moving through the pine trees outside the villa, a low, continuous sound, like the breathing of something very large and very patient. The sky beyond the glass walls was still black, salted with stars that looked close enough to touch. Julian was asleep beside me, one arm thrown across the pillow, his face arranged in the handsome, untroubled repose of a man who had never once in 38 years of living lost a night's sleep to his own conscience. I watched him for a long moment. Not with love that had been gone so long, I could no longer remember exactly when I had stopped feeling it the way you cannot remember the precise moment a fire goes out, only that at some point you looked and it was no longer there. What I felt watching him sleep was something closer to a kind of terrible clarity. The understanding that this was the last morning it would look like this. The last time I would lie beside this face and carry everything I knew about it alone. I got up without waking him, wrapped myself in a robe, and went to stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the mountain. The snow had come in overnight. It lay thick and absolute across every surface, the deck, the pine branches, the long slope of the valley below, and in the pre-dawn stillness, it had the quality of something held in suspension, the world between one breath and the next. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass and felt the chill travel up through my wrist and into my arm, and I was grateful for it. Gratitude for cold. I had reached that point. By 9 in the morning, the villa had taken on the particular performance quality of a day that everyone present knows is significant, and no one will acknowledge directly. Julian made coffee with elaborate care-grinding beans he had brought from a specialty roaster in Tribeca, moving around the kitchen with the satisfied proprietary ease of a man in a space he has already mentally claimed. Mitchell arrived from his guest room at 9:30 in a cashmere sweater and pressed slacks, carrying a leather portfolio that he set on the side table with a casualness so studied it was practically a theatrical gesture. Sandra was already dressed at 8. She sat at the kitchen island with her laptop open, ostensibly reviewing documents, but I had noticed in the way I had trained myself to notice everything that she had not turned a single page in 40 minutes. "Big day," Julian said to me, handing me a coffee cup with a warm smile. His eyes above the smile were bright with something that was not warmth at all. "Big day." I agreed and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out at the snow. At 11, I excused myself to my room and called Daniel on the prepaid phone. He answered before the first ring had completed. "Pavel left the motel at 7:40 this morning," he said immediately. "He drove past the villa twice on Highway 82, slow passes surveillance pattern. He's identifying entry points." My stomach tightened. Timeline. Sandra has been in contact with him 3 times since 6 a.m. The last message was sent at 10:52. A pause. The word she used was tonight. Tonight. I looked at the window at the mountain, at the white and patient landscape that had no idea what was moving through it. "The FBI team?" I asked. "4 agents in 2 vehicles positioned on the access road above the villa since last night. Patricia Novak is in the command vehicle. She has warrants for Julian Sandra and Mitchell financial fraud conspiracy attempted murder and 18 U.S.C. Section 229 for the BZ. His voice was measured, careful. "Everything is ready, Evelyn. We just need the evening to play out." "And Eleanor?" I asked. "She's in position. She arrived in Aspen yesterday afternoon," Daniel said. "She is calme." A pause that contained what sounded like suppressed amusement, very convincingly dressed. Despite everything, despite the tightness in my chest and the cold weight of the day pressing down on me from all directions, I felt a sudden, unexpected rush of warmth. "Tell her to come at 7, I said. "After the first course, before Mitchell brings out the documents." "She already knows," Daniel said. "She planned the timing herself." Of course she did. The afternoon passed in a kind of suspended unreality. We lit the fireplace. Mitchell and Julian reviewed documents together at the dining table with the quiet, satisfied efficiency of men finalizing the details of a transaction they believed to be already complete. Sandra prepared dinner in the kitchen rack of lamb-roasted root vegetables, a bottle of 2018 Chateau Margaux that Julian had selected specifically for tonight, moving through the space with a competence and a stillness that I recognized now as the focus of a woman with a second agenda running parallel to the first. At 4 o'clock, I went to the master bedroom, sat at the vanity, and looked at my face in the mirror for a long time. I looked tired. I looked older than 30. I thought like a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was approximately 3 hours from being able to set it down. I picked up my makeup brush and I began with great care and deliberate calm to put on the last mask I would ever wear for Julian Sterling. Foundation first, then concealer over the shadows beneath my eyes. Then the precise, unhurried lines that assembled Evelyn Sterling composed gracious, slightly fragile, completely unsuspecting for one final performance. When I was finished, I looked at my reflection and said quietly to no one in particular, "Let's finish this." Dinner began at 7 o'clock, precisely the way Julian preferred everything on schedule controlled the variables accounted for. The table was set with the villa's white linen and silver, the Chateau Margaux open, and breathing in its decanter, the rack of lamb resting under a tent of foil in the kitchen, while Sandra plated the first course with the focused efficiency of a woman running two timelines simultaneously. I sat at the head of the table. Julian sat at the other end. Mitchell occupied the chair to Julian's right, his leather portfolio on the floor beside him, close enough to reach without standing. Sandra took the remaining seat, crossing her legs at the ankle, arranging her napkin with small, precise movements. "To new beginnings," Julian said, lifting his wine glass. Mitchell raised his. Sandra raised hers. I raised mine and looked at Julian across the length of the table, across the candles, across the crystal. Across 6 years of a marriage I now understood had been a long, patient acquisition, and I smiled. "To new beginnings," I said. The first course was a winter squash bisque, smooth and deeply spiced, and for 20 minutes the conversation moved through the careful, pleasant shallows that Julian had always preferred at his dinner tables, a gallery opening in Chelsea, a real estate development in Hudson Yards, the relative merits of various ski resorts. Mitchell was in excellent form, relaxed and expansive. His courtroom warmth turned to its most appealing setting. Sandra contributed precisely calibrated observations at precisely calibrated intervals. I ate, I listened, I responded when addressed with the soft, slightly distracted affect of a woman who was present, but not entirely anchored the performance I had been refining since September. And beneath the table, my left hand was pressed flat against my thigh. Fingers spread wide, feeling the fabric of my dress against my palm, grounding myself in the texture of the reel. At 7:42, a knock landed on the front door. It was not a timid knock. It was not the knock of someone uncertain of their welcome. It was 3 measured strikes, deliberate, unhurried, completely assured, and in the silence of the villa, they carried with the clarity of a bell. Julian's head turned toward the door. A small vertical line appeared between his brows. "Who on earth?" he began. "I'll get it," I said, and was on my feet before he could object. I crossed the living room to the front door, and I was aware with every step of 3 sets of eyes tracking me from the dining table. I was aware of the cold seeping through the glass panels flanking the door, and the blue-black darkness beyond them, and the snow that had been falling since 4 o'clock, laying itself silently across the world outside. I opened the door. Eleanor Voss stood on the front step in her olive-green coat, her white hair dusted with snowflakes, her pewter-gray eyes absolutely steady. She was holding a small paper bag, a prop we had not discussed, but that I understood immediately, because Eleanor was a woman who understood that a detail can be the difference between a performance and a reality. She looked cold, she looked tired. She looked with complete and total conviction, like a lost elderly woman who had been walking in the snow for longer than was wise. "I'm so sorry to intrude," she said, and her voice carried just the right degree of careful dignity, the voice of someone who is embarrassed to need help but needs it nonetheless. "I'm so sorry to intrude. My car went off the road about half a mile back. I've been walking in the cold and I haven't eaten since this morning. Could I possibly trouble you for something to eat?" I felt my throat tighten with something that was not entirely performance. "Of course," I said and stepped back. "Please come in out of the cold." Eleanor stepped inside and I closed the door behind her, and I turned to find Julian standing at the edge of the living room, wine glass in hand, his expression arranged in the particular configuration of polite impatience he deployed when unexpected variables appeared in his plans. "Is everything all right?" Julian asked, his eyes moving from Eleanor to me with the quick, dismissive efficiency of a man who has already completed his assessment and found the subject beneath his attention. "Car trouble," I said. "She needs to use a phone." Julian's smile arrived thin-polished, pointed at its edges. He took a single step toward me and lowered his voice to the register he reserved for observations he wanted only me to hear. "Give her some cash and send her on her way, darling. She's tracking snow through the entire entryway." I looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then I turned to the villa's housekeeper, who had appeared silently in the kitchen doorway, and said in my full and carrying voice, "Please set an additional place at the table. Our guest will be joining us for dinner." The housekeeper nodded and disappeared. Julian's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did a small, precise recalibration, the look of a man who has just encountered a variable he had not accounted for. He said nothing. He turned back toward the table, lifting his wineglass, with the unhurried ease of someone declining to acknowledge that he has just been refused. Eleanor caught my eye from across the room. She said nothing either, but the corner of her mouth lifted barely just a fraction, and I understood in that fraction that she had expected exactly this and had already decided what it meant. Eleanor moved into the room with small, careful steps, and I watched Julian watch her. The olive coat, the white hair, the slight stoop she had added to her posture with a skill I found quietly astonishing, and I saw the moment his assessment completed itself. Elderly, harmless, temporary inconvenience. He had made the same mistake about me. I went to the kitchen to retrieve my phone, the old one. The one Julian's spyware lived in, the one I had been carrying for exactly this purpose, and when I returned, Eleanor was standing near the fireplace holding her cold hands toward the heat, and Mitchell had resumed his seat, and Sandra was watching Eleanor with an expression I could not entirely read. I handed Eleanor the phone. Our fingers touched briefly as she took it. "Thank you, dear," she said, looking directly at me. And then Julian said from his chair at the head of the table in a voice that carried perfectly across the quiet room, "Mitchell, I think now is as good a time as any. Why don't you bring out those documents?" Mitchell reached for his portfolio. My heart rate did not change. My hands did not shake. My face remained soft and open and completely, devastatingly unsuspecting. I sat back down at the table, folded my hands in my lap, and watched Mitchell Hale place the durable power of attorney in front of me with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once imagined the evening might not go his way. He slid a Montblanc pen across the table toward me. The pen came to rest against my fingertips. And from her place by the fireplace, Eleanor Voss looked up from the phone she was not actually dialing and said in a voice that was no longer small or tired or uncertain, "Mr. Sterling, before your wife signs anything, I think there are some things you should know about the last time you saw your mother." The wine glass in Julian's hand cracked. The wine glass did not shatter. It cracked, a single clean fracture running from the base to the rim, the kind of break that happens when something is gripped too tightly for too long. A thin thread of Chateau Margaux ran down Julian's fingers and dripped onto the white linen tablecloth, spreading in a slow, dark bloom, and nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Eleanor Voss stood by the fireplace with her hands clasped in front of her. Her posture no longer the careful stoop of a cold and helpless old woman, but something entirely different, straight-spined, deliberate with the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed this moment in their mind so many times that the reality of it requires no adjustment whatsoever. "Who are you?" Julian's voice came out wrong. Too thin, too high. The voice of a man whose composure has just developed a fracture of its own. "My name is Eleanor Voss," she said. "I was the director of audit compliance at Banque Privée Voss et Associés in Geneva for 31 years. Before that, I was a colleague of your wife's mother, Catherine Sterling, at the University of Geneva." She paused, letting each sentence land with full weight before adding the next. "And before any of that, I was the woman who filed the report that had your mother Beatrice, born Beatrice Holloway, before she married your father, involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility in Burlington, Vermont, in October of 2010. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the fire crackling behind Eleanor and the wind against the glass and the sound of Mitchell Hale's portfolio zipper catching as his hand tightened involuntarily on the leather. Julian set the cracked wine glass down on the table. The thread of red continued to drip. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said. "I have a great deal of ideas," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Would you like me to continue?" She did not wait for his answer. She went to her grave waiting for an explanation that never came. Moving from the fireplace to the dining table, with slow, measured steps, not toward Julian, but to the empty chair at the table's center, which she pulled out and sat in, as though she had been expected all along. She was frightened. She had documentation, bank statements, correspondence, a series of wire transfers, suggesting that someone with access to her personal accounts had been systematically redirecting funds. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Over 18 months, approximately $340,000 had been moved to an account she did not recognize. "This is fabrication," Julian said. His jaw was tight. A muscle flickered beneath his left eye. "The account," Eleanor continued as though he had not spoken, "was registered to a company called Horizon Asset Management. Horizon Asset Management was incorporated in Delaware in 2008 by a 21-year-old finance student at NYU. She looked at Julian with her pewter gray eyes and held his gaze without blinking. "I believe you remember incorporating it." Across the table, I watched Julian's face. I had been watching it for 6 years, cataloging its expressions, the way I catalog the condition of old paintings, every hairline crack, every area of instability, every place where the surface was at risk of giving way. What I saw now was something I had never seen before. Not anger, not calculation. Something beneath both of those, raw and cornered and suddenly very young. "You went to the authorities with your mother's documentation," Eleanor said. "Not to help her, to get ahead of it. You told the evaluating psychiatrist that your mother had been making accusations against family members for years, that she had a history of paranoid ideation, that the documents she was presenting as evidence were the product of a confused and deteriorating mind." Eleanor's voice did not waver. It did not soften. It was the voice of a woman reading from a record. "The psychiatrist committed her on a 72-hour hold. The hold was extended. She remained in that facility for 4 months. My hand moved to my mouth. I had not known this. Daniel had given me the outline, Margaret Holloway, Vermont, 2010. But not this. Not the mechanics of it. Not the specific surgical cruelty of a 21-year-old boy using his mother's love for him as the instrument of her destruction. My eyes burned. I pressed my fingers hard against my lips and breathed. "She died 14 months after her release," Eleanor said quietly. "Cardiac failure," the certificate said. "But I was her friend for 40 years, and I knew Beatrice, and I know that some people die because the thing that kept them alive has been taken from them." She paused. She never stopped believing that her son would explain himself, that there had been some mistake. Eleanor moved from the fireplace to the dining table with slow, measured steps. "I don't have to sit here and—" "You do, actually." The voice came from Sandra, and it stopped everyone, including Julian. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her expression something I had never seen on her face before. Not the cold calculation I had come to recognize, something harder, something that had been decided a long time ago and was only now being revealed. "Sit down, Julian." He stared at her. "Sit down." He sat, slowly, like a man discovering that the chair beneath him is not the one he thought it was. Sandra reached into her blazer pocket and placed a small USB drive on the table beside the DPOA documents. She slid it toward Mitchell Hale with one finger. "Everything on that drive goes to the FBI tonight," she said, her voice completely flat. "Julian's Macau accounts, the Horizon Asset Management Incorporation documents, the wire transfers from Claire Sterling's trust fund, the Shadow Reach spyware purchase receipt." She looked at Mitchell, who had gone the color of old wax. "Including your invoice, Mitchell, the one you sent to Julian's Luxembourg shell company in February. $340,000 for what was the line item estate restructuring consultation. Mitchell opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I looked at Sandra across the table. She did not look at me. She was looking at Julian with an expression I understood completely, because I had felt its exact equivalent every morning, for the past 4 months, the expression of a woman who has finished being someone else's instrument. "You told me she was already sick," Sandra said to Julian, her voice dropping to something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. "You told me the trust fund money was yours by right. You told me a lot of things." Her jaw tightened. "Eleanor called me 3 weeks ago. She told me the rest." Julian's face had gone completely still. The muscle beneath his eye had stopped flickering. He looked sitting there in the candlelight of his perfect Christmas dinner, like a man watching the walls of a room he built himself close in from every direction at once. "Evelyn," he said. His voice cracked on my name. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years, and what crossed his face in that moment was something I had not expected and did not know how to hold. Not defiance, not calculation, shame. "Evelyn, don't," I said. My voice was quiet and absolute. "Whatever you're about to say, don't." I reached across the table and picked up the Mont Blanc pen. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight in my fingers, expensive, considered, chosen to impress, and then I set it down on top of the DPOA document. And I stood up, walked to the front window, and turned on the porch light. The porch light was a single bulb, housed in a brushed steel fixture, mounted beside the front door. Nothing remarkable. Nothing architectural. Just a functional detail I had noted during my first walkthrough of the villa 3 years ago, and filed away, the way I filed away everything that might one day be useful. When I flipped the switch, it cast a warm amber circle across the snow-covered deck, reaching perhaps 12 feet into the darkness before the mountain swallowed it. To anyone watching from the access road above it was a beacon. I stood at the window with my back to the room and counted. 1, 2, 3. The snow was still falling slow and unhurried, each flake catching the amber light for a fraction of a second before disappearing into the white below. I could hear behind me the particular quality of silence that exists in a room where several people are holding very still. Then Julian spoke. "What did you just do?" I turned around. He was on his feet, both hands flat on the table, the cracked wine glass still leaking its slow thread of red onto the linen. His face had moved past shame now, back into something more familiar, the sharp assessing intelligence that had always been his most dangerous feature, the quality that had allowed him to maintain a performance of decency for 6 years while systematically dismantling everything around him. "Evelyn." His voice was low and controlled and very, very careful. "What did you just do?" "I turned on the porch light," I said. The first sound was tires on the access road muffled by the snow, but unmistakable the particular crunch of vehicles moving with deliberate speed. Then headlights swept across the upper windows, 2 sets, and Julian's head turned toward them with the involuntary precision of a man whose survival instincts have just overridden everything else. Mitchell Hale stood up so abruptly his chair scraped backward and struck the wall. His portfolio slid from the table and hit the floor, spilling documents across the stone, the DPOA, the estate transfer forms, the trust restructuring papers, all of it fanning out across the floor like a confession. "Julian." Mitchell's voice was not the rich courtroom-calibrated instrument I had heard all evening. It was thin and cracked at the edges, the voice of a man whose carefully constructed world has just begun to come apart at the seams. "Julian, we need to—" "Shut up, Mitchell." Julian's eyes had not left my face. Sandra had not moved. She sat with her hands still folded on the table, the USB drive still sitting beside her water glass, her expression carrying the particular composure of a woman who has made her decision and is now simply waiting for the consequences of it to arrive. They came through this front door at 8:51 p.m. Agent Patricia Novak was first 43 years old, compact and precise, in a dark tactical jacket with FBI across the chest in gold letters that caught the firelight. Behind her came 3 additional agents moving through the villa's entrance with the efficient, practiced calm of people who have done this many times and understand that speed and noise are not the same thing as effectiveness. Julian Sterling. Patricia Novak said, her voice carrying across the room with absolute clarity. You are under arrest. Financial fraud conspiracy to commit fraud forgery of legal documents theft from a protected trust and attempted administration of a chemical weapon in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 229. Julian did not move for 3 full seconds. He stood at the table with his hands still flat on the linen, and I watched him in those 3 seconds, watched the calculations running behind his eyes, the rapid involuntary assessment of every possible exit, every conceivable argument, every remaining variable. I had watched him calculate his way through 6 years of our marriage. I knew the exact quality of that stillness. Then his shoulders dropped barely perceptibly, perhaps half an inch, and something went out of him. Not defeat exactly, something more fundamental than that. The exhaustion of a man who has been running a very long race and has just at last stopped. I want my lawyer, he said. Mr. Hale is also under arrest, Patricia said, and nodded to the agent on her left who moved toward Mitchell with practiced efficiency. I'd recommend calling someone else. Mitchell made a sound, not words, just a sound high and involuntary as the handcuffs clicked into place. His face had gone completely white, the polished professional surface stripped away entirely, leaving something underneath that was simply frightened and small. Sandra stood without being asked, extending her wrists with a composure that I found despite everything genuinely remarkable. I have a cooperation agreement, she said to Patricia Novak. My attorney filed it with the Southern District this morning. Patricia looked at her for a moment, with the measured appraisal of someone recalibrating. We're aware, she said. You'll come with us regardless. Sandra nodded once and allowed herself to be guided toward the door. As she passed me, she stopped just briefly, just for a moment, and looked at me directly. Her eyes were dark and entirely unreadable, and what she said was so quiet that only I could hear it. I should have looked more carefully, she said. At the beginning, I did not know entirely what she meant, whether she meant she should have looked more carefully at Julian, or at me, or at the particular intersection of those two things that had produced this evening. But I nodded a small, genuine acknowledgement, because whatever Sandra Reeves had done, and whatever her motivations had been, she had in the end placed a USB drive on a table when it mattered. They led Julian out last. He passed within 3 feet of me on his way to the door, and he stopped. The agent behind him paused, allowing it, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 6 years of marriage. Not the catalog model warmth, not the sharp, assessing intelligence, not the shame from earlier, something nakeder than all of those. Did you ever love me? He asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. At the beginning. Was any of it real? My throat tightened. My eyes went hot. I had prepared for many things about this evening. The documents, the confrontation. The arrest, Eleanor's revelations. I had not prepared for this question asked in this voice at this moment. Yes, I said. Because it was true. Because whatever Julian Sterling had become, I had loved the person I believed him to be, with everything I had, and that deserved an honest answer, even here, even now. That was real. Something moved across his face. It lasted less than a second. Then the agent touched his arm, and Julian Sterling walked through the door of the Aspen Villa and into the amber circle of the porch light and the cold mountain dark, and I stood at the window and watched him go. I did not cry. I had cried enough. What I felt standing there in the firelit quiet with Eleanor Voss at my side, and the snow still falling outside, and the ruins of Christmas dinner on the table behind me, was something I had almost forgotten was possible. Relief. Pure, exhausted, absolute relief. Eleanor placed her hand on my arm, light as paper, warm as anything. It's over, she said softly. I covered her hand with mine. No, I said. It's just beginning. Christmas morning arrived without asking permission, the way mornings do after nights that have rearranged everything. I had not slept. I had sat in the armchair beside the stone fireplace from the time the last FBI vehicle disappeared up the access road until the sky outside the glass walls began its slow, reluctant shift from black to charcoal to the particular shade of pale blue that belongs exclusively to high-altitude dawns, a color so clean and so cold that looking at it felt like pressing your face against something pure. The villa was very quiet. The dinner table still held the remnants of the evening half-empty wine glasses, the decanter with its last inch of Chateau Margaux. Mitchell's documents scattered across the floor where his portfolio had fallen, and no one had thought to gather them. The Mont Blanc pen lay on the tablecloth where I had set it down parallel to the edge, its gold nib catching the first light from the windows with a small, indifferent gleam. I looked at it for a long time. Then I got up, walked to the table, picked up the pen, and dropped it into the kitchen trash. Eleanor had stayed. I had not asked her to. She had simply not left, which I was coming to understand was characteristic of her approach to most situations. She had folded herself into the corner of the sofa with a blanket across her lap and a cup of tea, real tea, nothing from Beatrice's collection, and had dozed intermittently through the small hours, her white head tilting forward and then catching itself with the unconscious reflex of someone who has learned to sleep lightly. When the sky began to lighten, she was awake. I became aware of her eyes on me from across the room, steady and alert, and I turned from the window to find her watching me with an expression that was entirely without performance. No careful calibration, no professional restraint. Just an old woman looking at a younger one with something that was simply and completely care. "How do you feel?" she asked. I considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "Like a painting that's been stripped back to the ground layer," I said. "Everything on top of it, the varnish, the overpainting, all the accumulated damage gone. Just the original surface, whatever was there before anyone put a brush to it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is an extraordinarily precise description. I've had all night to work on it." She smiled a real smile, small and warm, the kind that reaches the eyes of people who have lived long enough to mean what their faces say. Daniel Cross arrived at the villa at 8:15, driving a rental SUV up the access road with the careful, unhurried deliberateness of a man who has spent a very long night coordinating the logistics of 3 simultaneous arrests and has earned the right to take the last quarter mile slowly. He knocked twice, came in, accepted the coffee I handed him without comment, and sat at the kitchen island looking for the first time since I had known him genuinely tired. "Julian Mitchell and Sandra are in federal custody in Glenwood Springs," he said. "They'll be transferred to the Southern District of New York after the holiday." Patricia Novak team executed a simultaneous warrant on Pavel Orlov at his motel at 9:06 last night. He was arrested without incident. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "The aquarium wallet has been flagged for a separate warrant. A forensic team will access the penthouse next week." "Claire's trust fund," I said. "How quickly can the stolen funds be traced and frozen?" "Patricia's financial crimes unit has already filed for a restraining order on all accounts connected to Julian's shell companies. The $2.5 million from Claire's trust is categorized as priority recovery." He looked at me steadily. "It won't be immediate, the legal process takes time, but the money is traceable and it is frozen. It's not going anywhere." I let out a breath I felt as though I had been holding since October. "4 more months of treatment," I said quietly. "That's what was left in her account." "I know," Daniel said. "I've already spoken to a colleague at a nonprofit legal fund that covers treatment costs for victims of financial crimes while recovery proceedings are underway. They've agreed to review Claire's case on an expedited basis." He paused. "She won't lose her place at the clinic." My throat closed entirely. I pressed both hands flat on the kitchen counter and dropped my head forward for a moment, breathing through the tightness. And when I looked up, my eyes were full, but I was smiling unsteadily, imperfectly, but genuinely, and without performance for the first time in what felt like years. "Thank you," I said. "Daniel, thank you." He shook his head slightly, the way people do when they are uncomfortable with gratitude. They feel they have simply done their job to earn. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You have a very long legal process ahead of you." "I know," I said. "I'm not afraid of long processes. I restore paintings for a living." After Daniel left, Eleanor and I sat together on the deck in the cold mountain morning, wrapped in blankets from the villa's linen closet, holding mugs of coffee that steamed in the sharp air. The snow had stopped overnight, and the world below the villa was white and still and enormous, the valley spreading out in every direction, under a sky that had gone from pale blue to something warmer. The particular gold of high-altitude Christmas morning, the kind of light that exists nowhere else, and justifies, I have always thought, the difficulty of altitude. "Tell me about my mother," I said. Eleanor turned to look at me. Something moved across her face, the careful handling of something precious and slightly fragile. "She was extraordinary," Eleanor said, "the kind of brilliant that makes other brilliant people feel more capable, not less. She had a gift for seeing the structure of things, the underlying architecture, and for explaining it in language that made it feel inevitable. Like, of course it worked that way. Of course." She paused. "She was also stubborn beyond all reason, which is why she would have found Julian's plan completely intolerable. You cannot deceive someone who has spent their life looking at underlying structures." I thought about that, about restoration work, about the way I approached every damaged painting by looking for what was beneath the surface, damaged the original intention of the artist, the logic of the composition before time and accident intervened. My mother's gift, running in my blood without my ever knowing it. "She would have been proud of you," Eleanor said, simply without elaboration, the way true things are said when they don't need dressing. My eyes filled completely this time. I did not try to stop it. I let the tears come freely there on the deck in the Christmas morning light, and I cried for my mother, whom I had lost too young, and for the years of her friendship with Eleanor that I had never known about, and for the strange circular grace of the fact that her oldest friend had been the one to find me. Eleanor did not offer comfort beyond her presence. She sat beside me in the cold and let me cry, and that was, I discovered, exactly enough. When I was finished, she refilled my coffee without being asked. "What happens now?" I asked. Eleanor looked out at the valley, at the white, enormous world below us, at the gold light moving slowly across the snow. "Now," she said, "you go home and rebuild what is yours." January arrived in Manhattan the way it always does, without sentiment, without ceremony, with the particular brisk efficiency of a month that has no interest in the wreckage left by the one before it. The city had already moved past Christmas, the trees stripped from the sidewalks, the decorations taken down, the brief collective softness of the holiday season packed away for another year. By January 3rd, Midtown looked exactly as it always did, purposeful, indifferent, entirely itself. I found this deeply comforting. The first thing I did when I returned to the penthouse was call a locksmith, then a cybersecurity firm, not Petra's network, a different one, independent, recommended by Patricia Novak office, who spent 2 full days sweeping every device, every system, every camera and sensor in the apartment for remnants of shadow reach and any secondary applications it might have installed. They found 3. They removed all of them with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of people who do this regularly and have long since stopped being surprised by what husbands install on wives' devices. On the 3rd day, I called the building manager of the Sterling Building on 38th Street and told him I was coming in. The Sterling Building was my grandfather's. Edmund Sterling had built it in 1961 with money he had earned over 30 years as a structural engineer. Not inherited, not borrowed, not leveraged from someone else's labor, but earned deliberately with his hands and his mind. He had designed the lobby himself, a clean mid-century space with terrazzo floors and a brass elevator bank that still ran 64 years later with the smooth, unhurried precision of something built to last. His name was in the cornerstone. I had touched it as a child, tracing the letters with my fingers, understanding even then that a name in stone means something different from a name on paper. Julian had forged my signature on a mortgage against that building, had used my grandfather's name, the weight of it, the history of it, as collateral for his Macau debts. I stood in the lobby on the morning of January 7th and pressed my palm flat against the terrazzo wall and breathed, "Mrs. Sterling?" The building manager, a careful man named Robert Osei, who had worked the property for 19 years, appeared from his office with a folder, and the expression of someone who has been waiting for this conversation with a mixture of relief and apprehension. I'm glad you're here. There are some things I need to show you. I know, I said. Show me everything. The mortgage documentation took 3 weeks and 2 law firms to begin unwinding. The forged signature had been executed with enough sophistication. Julian had apparently studied samples of my handwriting for months before attempting it, that the initial bank review required handwriting analysis from an independent forensic expert. The expert's report delivered on January 22nd was unambiguous. The signature on the mortgage deed was not mine. It had been produced by someone who had spent considerable time learning to approximate my handwriting, but had not accounted for the particular pressure patterns of my pen grip, which are apparently distinctive to the point of constituting a form of fingerprint. My grandfather's building was in legal terminology encumbered. Unwinding that encumbrance would take months, but the process had begun, and the bank, faced with documentation of fraud and a pending federal criminal case, had agreed to a payment suspension while the courts worked through the recovery proceedings. It was not fast, it was not clean, but it was moving. Patricia Novak called me on January 24th. The Southern District has filed 47 counts against Julian Sterling. She said, her voice carrying the contained satisfaction of someone who has built a case for a very long time and watched it arrive in court exactly as constructed. Financial fraud, conspiracy, forgery, theft from a protected trust fund, and the Section 229 chemical weapons charge for the BZ. Mitchell Hale has entered a guilty plea on 4 counts in exchange for cooperation testimony. His law license has been suspended pending disbarment proceedings. And Sandra? I asked. Her cooperation agreement stands. She'll testify against Julian at trial. Sentencing will depend on the judge, but her attorneys are optimistic about a reduced term. A pause. Pavel Orlov is looking at federal conspiracy and solicitation charges. His attorney is currently deciding whether to fight it. I sat with that for a moment. The weight of 47 counts. The architecture of consequence finally assembled around the man who had spent 3 years building the architecture of my dissolution. Thank you, Patricia, I said. Thank yourself, she said. You built this case. We just arrested it. On February 3rd, I flew to Zurich. The clinic where Claire lived was in Kusnacht, on the eastern shore of Lake Zurich, a low, quiet building set among bare winter trees with large windows that looked out over the water. It was the kind of place that costs an extraordinary amount of money to look so completely unassuming. I had called ahead. Claire knew I was coming. But when I walked through the clinic's front entrance and saw her waiting in the reception area, small, 19 years old, with our mother's dark eyes and our father's stubborn jaw and hair that needed cutting, my chest cracked open so completely and so suddenly that I had to stop walking for a moment just to stay upright. She stood up when she saw me. Evie, she said. Her voice was cautious, careful in the way of someone who has learned through long experience that the things she hopes for do not always arrive. I crossed the reception room in 6 steps and put my arms around my sister and held her with everything I had, and she went rigid for just a moment. The reflex of someone who has not been held safely in a long time. And then she folded into me completely. Her arms coming around my back, her face pressed against my shoulder, and she cried the way children cry, the way people cry, when they have been waiting for permission and have finally at last received it. I cried too, openly, without any attempt at management or control, my face pressed into her hair, my hands holding her as though something might try to take her if I loosened my grip. I'm sorry, I said against her hair. Claire, I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner. You're here now, she said. Her voice was muffled but fierce, stubbornly, characteristically fierce. You're here now. That's enough. We stood there in the reception of the Kusnacht clinic, while the lake outside the windows lay flat and silver under the February sky, and I held my 19-year-old sister and felt for the first time since this had all begun that the thing I was rebuilding was not a company or a building or a financial portfolio. It was a family, whatever remained of one, whatever we could make from what was left. Eleanor had been right. I had gone home, and I had begun. There is a concept in painting conservation called in-painting, the practice of filling losses. When a canvas has been damaged when time or accident or deliberate harm has removed sections of the original surface, the conservator does not attempt to recreate what was there with false confidence. Instead, she works with what remains. She studies the surrounding brushwork, the color relationships, the logic of the composition, and she fills the losses in a way that is honest, visible under ultraviolet light, distinguishable from the original upon close examination, but integrated enough that from a normal viewing distance the painting reads as whole. The goal is not to pretend the damage never happened. The goal is to make the damage livable. I had been thinking about in-painting a great deal since I returned from Zurich. I reopened the restoration studio on the first Monday of February, 6 weeks after the Aspen arrests, and 3 days after I returned from seeing Claire. My team, Marcus, Diane, and Priya, were already there when I arrived, which told me they had been informed I was coming and had chosen to come in early regardless. Nobody made a speech. Nobody asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. Marcus handed me a coffee. Diane had restocked the pigment drawers in my absence, organizing them in the chromatic sequence she knew I preferred. Priya had printed and pinned to the studio notice board a conservation report on the mid-century oil painting I had deliberately damaged in September, the one I had used to perform my dissolution, with a small note attached in her careful handwriting, "Ready for treatment whenever you are." I stood in the doorway of my studio, looking at these three people who had simply shown up, and my throat tightened so completely that I had to set my coffee down on the nearest table and press both hands flat against the surface and breathe. "Right," I said when I trusted my voice again. "Let's get back to work." The mid-century painting took 11 days to restore properly. The mineral spirits damage I had inflicted in September had penetrated further into the paint layer than I had intended. My performance of carelessness had been ironically more convincing than I realized at the time. Reintegrating the affected area required careful cleaning, consolidation of lifting paint edges, and finally the in-painting itself, a process I approached with the particular focused attention that I had always found in some fundamental way to be the closest thing I knew to prayer. Each session in the studio was 3 or 4 hours of stillness, of narrowed attention of the world outside the canvas, simply ceasing to exist. I had missed it with an intensity I had not fully acknowledged while I was performing vulnerability and attending meetings with lawyers and coordinating FBI raids. The work had always been where I was most completely myself, the place where my hands and my mind operated in the same direction toward the same purpose, without subterfuge or performance, or the exhausting management of other people's perceptions. On the 11th day, I set down my brush and looked at the finished painting. It was whole. Not perfect, the in-painted areas would always be visible under the right light, and I had documented them precisely in the conservation report, as I always did. But from a normal viewing distance in normal light, it read as a complete and coherent work. A painting that had survived damage and been thoughtfully, honestly repaired. I sat looking at it for a long time without moving. Daniel Cross came by the studio on a Thursday afternoon in late February, unannounced, in the way of someone who has learned that Eleanor Voss's approach to visits is occasionally contagious. He accepted a coffee, looked at the restored painting on the easel for a moment without comment, and then sat on the spare stool with his elbows on the work table. "Julian's trial date has been set for September," he said. "The 47 counts are proceeding. His defense team has filed 2 motions to suppress, both denied." He paused. "The aquarium wallet has been accessed, and the $3.5 million in cryptocurrency has been frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. That amount, combined with the shell company assets already seized, brings the total recoverable figure to approximately $28 million. "Claire's trust fund?" I asked. "Full recovery of the $2.5 million has been authorized by the court. The transfer back to the trust account is scheduled for next week." I set my coffee mug down very carefully on the work table. My hands were completely steady. My eyes, however, were not cooperating, and I let them fill without attempting to manage it, because I had learned over the course of the last several months, in the company of a 72-year-old former Swiss bank auditor, who had taught me more about dignity than anyone I had ever met, that tears are not a form of weakness. They are simply the body's way of acknowledging that something matters. Good, I said. My voice was rough but clear. That's good. Daniel looked at me with his steady gray eyes for a moment. Then he said, "How are you, Evelyn?" Not the case, you. I considered the question the way I had learned to consider Eleanor's questions seriously without deflection. "I'm in painting," I said. He looked at the canvas on the easel. Understanding moved across his face without requiring explanation. "That sounds about right," he said. Eleanor came for dinner on the last Friday of February. She brought a bottle of Swiss white wine, a variety I had never heard of, which she described as aggressively underrated, and she sat at my kitchen island and watched me cook with the same focused, assessing attention she brought to everything. "Claire called me," Eleanor said during the pasta. I looked up. "She did. 3 days ago. She wanted to know about your mother." Eleanor turned her wineglass slowly between her fingers. "We spoke for 2 hours. She asked very good questions." A pause. "She has Margaret's mind." My chest ached, the kind that comes from something expanding rather than something breaking. "She's going to be all right," I said, not as a question. "She's going to be considerably more than all right," Eleanor said with the conviction of a woman who has been assessing human potential for 7 decades and knows the difference between hope and certainty. "As are you." After dinner, we took our wine to the window and stood looking out at Manhattan, the lights of the city spreading in every direction, the Hudson dark and moving far below the whole enormous, indifferent, endlessly regenerating organism of the place, simply continuing to exist as it always had, regardless of what happened inside any of the millions of lit windows stacked against the dark. "I've been thinking about what comes next," I said. "Tell me," Eleanor said. "I want to establish a foundation," I said, "in my mother's name, for women who are being financially exploited within marriages, access to legal resources, forensic accounting support, safe documentation channels." I paused. The things I needed and didn't know existed. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said simply, "Margaret would have built exactly that." I looked out at the city lights, at the 10,000 lit windows, at all the lives behind them carrying whatever they were carrying, moving through whatever they were moving through. "Then let's make sure it exists," I said. Standing on the deck in the golden light of Christmas morning, I looked out at the vast, silent valley. I am proud that I fought back, but my ultimate victory came with a heavy cost. Experiencing such a calculated family betrayal from the man I shared my bed with for 6 years completely shattered my reality. If there is one thing I could tell you, it is this: do not be naive like I was. Do not ignore those silent red flags, and never allow love to blind your instincts. This was not just about getting even, it was about survival and justice. I genuinely believe God gave me my restoration training for a reason, and that reason was to look past the beautiful surface and dismantle the canvas of a ruthless family betrayal before it consumed my sister's future. In my opinion, execution is everything. When dealing with deep family betrayal, you must stay calm, document every detail systematically, and strike only when you have unshakable proof. Turning a blind eye only invites devastation. This wasn't a choice. It was a necessary act of family revenge to protect what was left. I had to orchestrate this cold family revenge because waiting for them to change would have destroyed us. Sometimes the ultimate form of family revenge is simply forcing the truth into the light. If Evelyn's story resonated with you, what would you have done in my position? Drop a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more valuable life lessons. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Please note, the upcoming stories include dramatic and fictionalized elements, tailored for educational purposes. If high-stakes corporate drama isn't for you, feel free to exit and choose another content path that suits you better.